All right, so good morning, everybody. My name is Jesse, and I am with Exploring by the Seat of Your Pants. If you're joining us for the first time, we are all about bringing conservation, adventure, and science into classrooms around the world. And it has been such a thrill over this month, doing over 35 broadcasts featuring amazing scientists, explorers, and organizations around the world. I know it's a very odd time to be a teacher, so we really appreciate you tuning in live or on YouTube as we continue to feature such great stories. So a few weeks ago, I had the distinct pleasure of talking with Franco Mariotti. It was one of the most enthusiastic phone calls I've ever had. I'm usually the most enthusiastic person in a phone call, but not so this time. And we were chatting about Sudbury. So if you're like me, when you think about big ecological stories and habitat loss and ecosystem changes and all these things, your mind goes to some far off place. I'm here in Toronto, and I can tell you that I think of jungles and coral reefs and all these amazing places around the globe. But what Franco talked about was Sudbury, a place that's fairly close to home to me here in Toronto, a 3.5-hour run up the highway, and that it is one of the best, most incredible stories of ecological restoration in the entire world. So I'm really excited to dive in with him. I know we've got a lot of Ontario classrooms and a few from across the continent today, so I hope you'll enjoy as much as I do hearing about this really cool tale. So Franco, thank you so much for joining us today, and take us away.
Thanks, Jesse. Hi, everybody, and welcome. I should just let you know, this is going to be a story of hope. I'm covering 3 parts. I'm going to show you first what our city, Sudbury, used to look like. Then I'm going to talk about the change, the regreening. And lastly, I'm going to talk about why regreening was so successful here, which could be a lesson for anybody else across the country, across the world. So here we go. Just to give you an idea for those who aren't sure where Sudbury is, there's a picture of a satellite image of Canada and the Great Lakes. Here's the province where I live, Ontario, and Sudbury is that red dot. If you look to the right bottom, just above the Great Lakes, that's where Sudbury is located. So most of Canada is to the north of us. And just to give you an idea for those of you who are in the United States, our neighbors to the south, Ontario, just northern Ontario, is about bigger than the size of the state of Texas. So it's a huge territory. Now, let me show you what our city, Sudbury, looks like. And by the way, I apologize if you're seeing that stop sharing thing at the bottom. I can't get rid of it, but that's okay. It won't affect the images. This is an aerial picture of Sudbury surrounded by trees. That's what Sudbury looks like today. It's a beautiful place downtown. This is the Science Center where I worked for about 32 years. It's Canada's second largest science center. And downtown Sudbury is made up of a lake. But not only that, within the city limits of Sudbury, there are, get this, 330 freshwater lakes, which is an amazing number. The footprint of Sudbury, in other words, the size of the city is about 4,000 square kilometers, which is a little over 2,000 square miles. It's huge. So we're a very large place, even though our population is only about 160,000. The reason why Sudbury is here is because of mining. And this is a picture of the huge smelter and the big chimney that is located at the smelter. We call this the Superstack. Now you're wondering, how tall is that? Well, I think a lot of you have heard of the Empire State Building. Well, this Superstack is 50 feet or about 30 meters, 25 meters higher than the Empire State Building. That's almost 400 meters or 1,250 feet high, which is humongous. Today, this is what you see. This is the Science Center, an aerial view where I worked in downtown Sudbury. But all to show you that the Sudbury I grew up in did not look like this. Let me show you. I'm going to take you back to 1960 and let your eyes adjust to this early picture. Pretty bleak, isn't it? First, I should tell you, this is not a black and white photograph. It's a color photograph. And I'm looking towards the smelter before the Superstack was built. The 3 chimneys you see in the background that are spewing out that black smoke is spewing out sulfur, which creates acid rain. And all of that sulfur over the years killed most of the vegetation around Sudbury. That's why you don't see much green. Now, if you think this is bleak, let me show you what my backyard looked like. You ready? Now, that picture is a little bit out of focus, but all you see is black rock. And I would walk out of my house onto these, what we call the rocks. It looked like a moonscape. And I challenge you to try and find a single blade of grass. There isn't any. all the vegetation that used to be here has died. Now, of course, I grew up in this moonscape, so I didn't know any better. I didn't think that Sudbury used to look any different. But 100 years before, in other words, 4 human generations before, in about the late 1800s, Sudbury was created by the railroad that came through. When Canada was created in 1867, we were the product of that national dream. What I'm saying is that the politicians, the prime minister at the time, wanted to connect the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific Ocean. And you have to remember, back then, there were no cars. There were no telephones, right? Certainly no email or anything like that. So the only way to connect the Atlantic to the Pacific was by railroad. And the railroad came right through Sudbury. And because the trains were steam engines, they had to stop and collect water for the steam. And they stopped in an area where eventually would become Sudbury. They made a junction here, a little train station, and they would take up water. And around that little train station, prospectors started settling, and that was the beginning of Sudbury. Around Sudbury used to be some of the largest red and white pine forests in all of North America. Look at the size of these pine trees. And a lot of these pines were cut down not for buildings here, but they traveled. They were brought across the Great Lakes by schooner into the great cities of the northern US, like Chicago. And a lot of the wood, the pines that came from the Sudbury area, went to rebuild the Chicago after the famous Chicago fire. This is the first town of what eventually became Sudbury. The church in the background is called St. Anne of the Pines because of a Jesuit priest who settled here. And all of those old-fashioned homes were the homes of prospectors and people who were lumbering around Sudbury. And if you look carefully in the bottom right picture, you will see the stumps of the old red and white pine forest. But soon after, so this picture was taken in 1893. About 1,000 people were living here, not many. Shortly after, somebody discovered some funny colored rock along the railroad, and that color was copper and nickel. And people said, maybe there's a lot of minerals here. And it turned out to be that mining, within a few short years, overtook lumbering. More people were here mining than there were loggers. But all of that mining came with a little price. So in the early years, there were no stacks. There were things called a roast yard. So let me explain what you're seeing here. And by the way, that black speck almost in the center of the picture is a person standing on a pile of wood. And the wood, now get this, the wood covers 5 football fields, and it's stacked as tall as an adult person. You can imagine how much wood that takes. Now you're asking, why? What does this have to do with mining? I'll tell you. This is called a roast yard. You see, in order for people to take copper and nickel out of the rock, the Sudbury rock had a lot of sulfur mixed into it. And that blocked anybody from smelting the copper and the nickel out of the rock. So what the early scientists discovered was just burn the rock like a roast, like a big bonfire, right? And this is what a roast yard is. It's a huge bonfire. So if I were to take you back to 1920, 100 years ago, imagine 2 football fields side by side. And what you see early in the morning is a train carrying wood. Any trees that were left standing by the loggers were cut down, all clear cut, were brought to here, piled up, and then the trains would go away. And if we returned the next day, the trains would carry the ore, the rocks that the miners took out of the ground. And you see the rocks in the background piled up like a pyramid. And once that was finished, look at what they did. They set the whole roast yard on fire. The smoke coming off a roast yard would carry high levels of sulfur, which created acid rain, and the smoke traveled across the landscape, killing every bit of vegetation in its path. And now get this, a roast yard would burn for as long as 9 weeks, over 2 months, straight, 24 hours around the clock. And the landscape it left behind looked like this. Every bit of vegetation was killed. Now you could still see the soil in this picture, but eventually over the next few years, every time it rained, that soil would get washed down into the streams and would disappear. and would leave nothing but bare rock underneath. By 1928, everybody recognized that the roast yards were not very good for the environment. So the first of the chimneys, the stacks as we called it, were built. And there were 3 of them eventually, each 500 feet or about 150 meters in height. And that pushed the smoke further away. By the Second World War, 1943, 50,000 people were living here in Sudbury, and Sudbury gained a reputation as the nickel capital of the world. During the war, Sudbury supplied 95% of the Western world's nickel supply. A lot of that nickel went to build ships, tanks, but also stainless steel frying pans that you would have in your homes. So Sudbury was blossoming. Everybody was working, thriving, and we became known as the nickel capital of the world. But all of that fame led to this moonscape all around Sudbury. And even though the world knew us as the nickel capital of the world, people in the rest of Canada called us the city that looked like the moon. Now, I remember as a teenager walking across these rocks, playing. We always played in the rocks, and we would come across these tree stumps. And I would wonder, who brought them here? I thought somebody literally was cleaning their backyard somewhere and dropped them off. But of course not. These were the remnants of the large red and white pine forest that used to be here. I couldn't even imagine what the forest must have looked like, because the Sudbury, the only Sudbury I knew, looked like the moon. This lake was a lake that as teenagers, we would walk across the rocks and look how barren that moonscape looked like. To us, this was normal. And we would go swimming in this acid dead lake. In other words, there was so much sulfur in and around that it killed not only the vegetation, but it killed all of the life in the lakes in and around Sudbury. All 330 lakes, I think with the exception of one, were dead. There was no life in them. But we didn't think anything of it because in hot summer days, this was a great place to go swimming. And one day I remember I came back from swimming here in this small lake, and my neighbor, Louis, stopped me. And Louis was a retired miner. You know, he was in his early 70s then. And he said, Franco, he says, where are you coming from? I said, Louis, I'm coming from this lake, Clarabelle Lake. And this is what he said to me. He says, oh, yeah. He says, when I was your age, I used to bring cows grazing here. Now take a look at this picture. Where can an animal graze? There's not a single bit of vegetation. And I said to Louis, no, you must be mistaken. I'm talking about this lake. He says, yes. Yeah, I am too. He says, I used to bring cows grazing. Now, I didn't say anything else to Louis because I thought, okay, Louis is getting older. He's getting a little bit senile. You know, he's forgetting. And then later on, when I went to the university here in Sudbury called Laurentian, one of the classes I took was about early Sudbury and how much of the landscape was destroyed by the early mining. And so Louis was right. I had this flashback to the conversation with Louis, and Louis was absolutely right. And then I thought, how can we let this happen? How can we let a landscape that was once forested, the largest red and white pine forest, become a moonscape? So I want you to imagine for a second, this is what my backyard is supposed to look like. This would have been the red and white pine forest in my backyard. So imagine if this went to this in 1 year, one short period. You know what? Sudburyans would have been demonstrating the streets. Not only Sudburyans, but Canadians across the country would have been wanting to know, what are we doing to Sudbury? Why so much destruction? But nobody was demonstrating. And you know why? Because the change happened so slowly that no next generation recognized what the previous generation lost. In other words, the Sudbury I grew up in was a moonscape, and I always assumed that was natural. That's the way Sudbury always looked, but it wasn't. So in 1970, there was a professor at the university who wanted to change all of that. And the mining companies realized the damage they were doing, so they built an even taller stack. This is the Superstack. And the idea was that it was supposed to raise that sulfur high up into the atmosphere and dilute it and get rid of the pollution problem in and around Sudbury. Well, that worked for in and around Sudbury, but that sulfur still coming out of the stack polluted thousands of more lakes, hundreds of kilometers away, and killed all of these lakes, what we call acid dead. Again, because of the sulfur that created the acid rain that dropped into the lake and killed life and vegetation. In 1977, a professor at the university realized we could change the landscape. We could bring back the red and white pine. The problem was that that little bit of dirt that was left, that you see in and around the green, was so full of acidity and heavy metals that no plants would grow on it. So the professor had to come up with an idea of how to neutralize the acidity. So this was, what you're looking at here is the backyard of a school in Sudbury. Before then, you can imagine what their schoolyard must have looked like, this Moonscape. But that summer, he spread limestone, which neutralized the acidity in the soil, and planted grass seed. And lo and behold, within a few months, there was the first green patch in and around Sudbury. The following year, in 1978, the mining industry in Sudbury took a downturn. In other words, mining wasn't doing so well, and 1,000 miners were laid off. So the professor approached the city and said, listen, let's rehire these 1,000 miners and start doing a revegetation program. And so here you're seeing pictures of some of the not quite 1,000 miners, but there were 1,000 miners all over the landscape. And the white you see is not snow, but lime that neutralized a little bit of dirt that was still there. And then from that, they started planting trees. So I'm going to show you now before and after pictures of the same places in and around Sudbury. So here's a street at the edge of Sudbury so you could see that on the right and left side are people's front yards where they took care of their yards, brought in soil from outside the city, and can actually plant vegetation. But the back of the street, that Moonscape, was still there, all around people's homes. They lined it and planted the trees, and you're going to look at the same place 20-some years later, the same place. Now there's a forest. Now, could you imagine the difference for kids who are growing up at the forest right there at the end of the street? They could go into that forest, and there are birds singing, and there are snakes slithering around. And the price of the people's homes now are worth much more because there are green spaces in and around their community. Let's look at another place, another street at the edge of Sudbury. Some 20 years later, look at that. Green spaces now where the generation growing up can play in and amongst the trees and hide in the shade of these trees. Totally amazing. And of course, the price of the homes are worth more now too. But one of my best and favorite pictures are these two places. Now, here's a place that looks exactly like the moon, except for the antennas. And I'm going to show you the same place, and I want you to keep an eye out on that antenna in the background 28 years later. Look at that. We planted lime, we spread lime, which neutralized the acidity, then planted conifers, which used to be there. And you see birches and poplars coming up all on their own because nature now was behaving as if a forest fire had come through and the seeds came in and can grow on what used to be acidic soil. One last picture. Another Moonscape. I want you to keep your eye out on that white building in the center of the picture, which is the head frame of a mine. Ready? 28 years later. Look at that. Now, I know some of you may say, well, yeah, it's green, but that's not a very impressive forest. It's not very big. You're right. It's not very big. But in one human generation, we rebuilt an ecosystem. And every year, those trees are getting taller and taller, where today, some of those trees are almost 15 meters in height, which is unbelievable. And you walk in and amongst the trees and no longer see that Moonscape. So lastly, why was it successful? I mean, other places may have tried regreening and it may have lasted a few years, but here we are 42 years later from where we started in 1977, and we're still planting trees. The most important thing was that the professor from the university who had that vision of a green Sudbury again, he wanted those pines to come back, and he wanted trails through these forests in and around Sudbury. He shared his vision with the politicians, with the mining companies, and with other scientists. And then he shared it with the community. And you know why that's important? Because every Sudburian to this day almost every Sudburian has planted a tree as part of the regreening program. In other words, we were part of the solution. It wasn't just the regreening committee that did all the work. Almost every Sudburian and students from the schools have planted trees in and around Sudbury. And that, after a few years, we began to realize, my gosh, if we could do this, then we could do other good things. So we started reintroducing animals that were long since gone from Sudbury, like trumpeter swans. The last ones were hunted out in the late 1800s. Peregrine falcons that had disappeared because of pesticides were reintroduced into the Sudbury area. And they're still coming back and nesting in cliffs in and around Sudbury. Elk, eastern elk, which was extinct 100 years ago, is now reintroduced into an area south of Sudbury where the habitat is there. And then all of that inspired other community citizens to create their own groups and clean up the creeks in and around Sudbury, collecting garbage and planting trees and restoring fish to the creeks that come through the city, which is amazing because I used to know the main creek that came through Sudbury, Junction Creek. It was nicknamed Junk Creek because it had a lot of garbage. And now that creek actually has brook trout like it used to have decades ago. All of this was done by citizens. And lastly, this is the Superstack today. Look, there's no smoke coming out of that stack. As of last year, the mining companies worked so hard on the technology that they've eliminated the use of that Superstack. All of that sulfur is now being collected, turned into sulfuric acid and sold to other industries who could use that acid in their own businesses. And that stack, which I've grown up with, is going to come down sometime the next year or two. It's going to be a totally different face of Sudbury. This is the Sudbury of today, a green Sudbury. The city of lakes is what we like to call ourselves because all of the 330 lakes have fish in them. People could go fishing. And people want to move to Sudbury now because it's such a beautiful place. And here's the Science Center. We have become Northern Ontario's major tourist attraction. Something that 40 years ago would have been absolutely unbelievable because we were a moonscape. And today you cannot call us that. Sudbury is a greenscape surrounded by these beautiful young forests coming up and lakes that have life. To date, we have planted over 15 million trees. And when I say we, I mean almost everyone that lives here. And we continue to plant 250,000 trees every summer. We hire summer students. There are volunteers that continue, groups and individuals that continue to plant trees. So the number keeps growing every year. And all of this, I like to think, has created hope through restoring the environment. Questions?
Franco, that was awesome, man. If you want to come out of screen share so you can see us again, we can have a bit of a conversation. That would be great. Yeah. While you're doing that, I'm just going to say a huge shout out to all our groups on YouTube. I know Mr. Dunn's class is joining us from Sudbury, which is amazing. If any other classes are joining us on YouTube, let me know in the chat bar. I'd love to see where you guys are coming in from. And our live classes, which I've never seen teachers take more pictures of slides in the middle of a talk before, so that was great. Franco, so let's start. Miss Delcado's class, they're grade 1s, and they're joining us today from Toronto. Miss Delcado, if you want to kick us off with a question, come on in.
So the children wanted to know, did the animals leave? Is that what happened? Did they just leave?
Yeah.
Excellent question. In the case of the fish in the lakes, they literally died out. It began so that they could no longer, even though they tried to lay eggs, the eggs would not hatch. So eventually a lot of the lakes just had very old fish, and then they died out altogether. And any plants living in the lakes also died. On the landscape, the big animals would have left looking for other habitat, right? But things like tiny animals like shrews and mice, they can't travel very far. So there's a very good chance they probably died also. And of course, couldn't give birth because there was no food, no habitat for them, no home. So that's a very good question.
Yeah.
The interesting thing is, when I was working at the Science Center just a few short years ago, we would start getting calls from the public asking, what kind of insect is this? I haven't seen it around Sudbury before. So with regreening, a lot of animals and insects and plants have started coming back that we haven't seen here in decades, which is really good story.
Fantastic. Great first question, guys. Shout out to Mr. Ayard's class and Miss Plant's class joining us in Mississauga and Toronto as well on YouTube. So over 150 kids now, which is amazing. I'm going to go to hand over to Mr. Armstrong 678. If you want to demute your microphone, Mr. Armstrong, you're good to go.
Yes, done. And my students have a few questions. One is asking about the lake and whether you were able to swim back then, or would that have made you sick as a child?
Yeah.
And another student wants to know if those are all your personal pictures. And another is asking about the fires, if it was really the original fires that destroyed a lot of the environment.
Yeah.
Excellent questions. So first question was,
can you swim in the lake without it being?
Right, yes. Yeah, the answer is yes, because I wasn't living in the lake like a fish. I was only there for a few hours. So the acidity wasn't strong enough to do damage to your skin. Although there was one lake, one of the worst lakes in and around Sudbury, was almost to the acidity of vinegar, which, would have been very nice. But I never swam in that lake. Second question, most of those pictures of before and after were taken by one of my old professors from the university, and he gave me permission to use those, which is a blessing, because I think this story of Regreening in Sudbury ought to be shared all over the world. So most of them are from him. The early pictures were historical pictures from the Sudbury Public Library, and some of the most recent ones are mine. And the last question was, sorry?
Fires,
I guess it was about the fires originally. Whether most of the forest destruction took place because of the fires, or was it due to logging?
Excellent question. So the logging cleared the land without question, but you still would have had a lot of bushes and grasses and small animals running around, even though you have cleared the forest. What happened was there were increased fires, because one of the practices of the early prospectors was literally to burn the landscape to expose the rocks to see what minerals are there. But really, because the damaged area covers 80 square kilometers, most of that was done by the acidity from the smoke of the roast yards and then from the shorter stacks once those took over. So a lot of the damage, certainly to the lakes and to that 80 square miles, was ultimately by the acidity, the sulfur coming from the stacks. And by the way, the reason why the rocks look black is not because that's the natural color. It's because the acidity in the smoke burnt the surface of the rock. That's why it looks like the moon.
Yeah. Wild. Great question, Mr. Armstrong. And thank you.
I'm
going to go to Ms. Nybor's class, joining us in Oakville. They're grade 3s. Come on in and go for it.
Hi there. Shreya in my class is wondering, how did you, because the water was acidic, how did you end up neutralizing it and cleaning it so that it was safe again so you could reintroduce the fish?
Yeah.
Excellent question. And you know what? The belief early on was we were starting to regreen the landscape by planting trees. The idea was, okay, we're going to have to spread a lot of lime by air over the lakes to neutralize the acidity. But didn't happen. Didn't have to. You know what happened? When we started planting trees around the lakes, those trees would act like a filter, so that when the snow melted in the springtime, the trees and the vegetation took up a lot of those heavy metals and acidity and prevented the lake from becoming even more acid. And then what happened as the trees were growing, organic matter, dead leaves and branches, started flowing into the lakes, and that became food for aquatic insects once the acidity became more neutral. So now insects had food in the lakes to feed on, and then that attracted fish from upriver or downriver, came in from outside of Sudbury. They swam up and found the lakes had food for them to feed, and that's the way most of the lakes around Sudbury come back, all on their own, because of regreening.
I love it.
Amazing. Nobody would have predicted that.
It's so rare that we get this perfect story of how ecological restoration leads to other positive impacts. So that was a fantastic tale. I love it. Awesome. All right, I'm going to take a couple questions from YouTube, and then I'm going to come back to our live classes. So we've got one from Miss Plant's class. They're joining us in Mississauga, and they want to know, are there parts of Sudbury that still look like that moonscape? Are there parts that you couldn't recover anyway?
Excellent question. There are some parts of Sudbury, but you have to walk away from the roads quite a bit to see the moonscape, but there is one. There's one section that we have protected tried to leave alone where we've done no regreening, an area called Daisy Lake, and it's actually a provincial park. There's no camping there. There's no road to it. You have to walk across the rocks. So you walk through trees, through a forest, a young forest, then that turns to black rock and the lake is there. But what we're finding is that so much of regreening is becoming successful that the trees are starting to move in towards the lake. So that even though we're not doing any regreening purposely, in about 20, 30 years down the road, it's all going to be green again around the shoreline. And there are fish in the lake for the first time.
Yeah. Three cheers for Sudbury. Let's go back to our live groups. There's a perfect question from Mr. Dunn's student that we're going to wrap up the whole broadcast with in a little bit. But I want to go back to Miss Delcado's class and come on up.
Thank you. We just watched the original animation of the Lorax.
Yeah.
I just want to know what Franco, like, you must see so many parallels between that story and Sudbury's story. Can you just speak to that?
Absolutely. You know, people who know me, including my wife, say I'm a very optimistic person about the future. I'm optimistic that we can deal with climate change, right? Sudbury is a great example of, look, we don't have to accept some of the bad things that we grew up in. We can change an area. By using science, we can restore life to places that have no life. Sudbury is an example of that. You know, it's not a dream. So the Lorax story is exactly that. You know, it's a story that says what could be. Sudbury is an example of a real Lorax story. And the beauty of Sudbury is I could point to here and say, look at what we can do and look at what you can do. And we could tackle climate change the same way by working together with scientists, politicians, and industry. They have to work together, not just by themselves. And that's the example of Sudbury. And what I really mean that we create hope through environmental restoration.
I don't know how anyone could listen to you and not just have a big grin on their face, and this is reflected in the teachers in the background too. It's just, this is such a fun presentation. Mr. Armstrong's class, if you have another question for us, come on in, and then we'll come back to Ms. Nybor in a second.
One student's asking about the extent of the damage.
Yes.
He was asking about the kilometers, I guess, in terms of area. But I replied that maybe it was immeasurable and as far as the eye could see up there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question, Mr. Armstrong. As a teenager, I would walk from my house, walk across the Moonscape, and it would take me about 5 hours until I got to a tree line, literally a tree line. Bushes would begin to grow on the black rocks, and then hundreds of meters behind that, there were trees, and then you could walk into a forest. So we used to walk across the Moonscape, and that would take me about, it was about 9 to 10 kilometers away, the tree line. And so it would take all day to get there, play in the forest, see garter snakes for the first time in my life, and then walk back to the Moonscape in my home. Yeah. It was a huge area.
It is a huge area. I think you said 80 square kilometers earlier too. Like this
80 square kilometers.
Unbelievable. Yeah, great question, Mr. Armstrong. Let's go back to Ms. Nybor's class, and then we'll take a few more to wrap up at the end. Go for it.
Magna in my class is wondering where you got all the limestone to neutralize the soil so that the grass could start growing again.
Excellent question. And that is probably because limestone is close to us is the reason why we are so successful. So where it comes from is Sudbury itself is on the Canadian Shield, which is not limestone. It's granitic rock. So the nearest place is Manitoulin Island, which is an hour's drive away, not too far. And Manitoulin Island, for those of you who don't know, is the world's largest freshwater island. It's huge. It's about 100 kilometers more, probably more than that, long. So it's all limestone. And so there's plenty of limestone there. There's several quarries. You could mine the limestone, take it out, and crush it. And that's where we got it from.
Very cool question. It's one I would have wanted to ask myself. So thanks so much from Ms. Nybor's student. Alishba in Mr. Dunn's class, they're joining us in Sudbury Live. So many students, the comments on YouTube are great. She wanted to know, what can we do to help the community? So if you're still in Sudbury, what can you be doing to help keep this the story going?
So, okay, two things. If you're in Sudbury, you could contact the city and say, your class wants to go out and plant trees, and they will find you a spot where you can actually be a part of this legacy, this incredible legacy of continuing to plant trees. So that's the first thing. The second thing is you could also, I mean, don't think like when regreening began, the idea wasn't that we're just going to overnight change the landscape. We know it's taken 40 years to change, but look at the incredible change. It far surpassed anything we could have imagined. So start small. And the best thing one could combat to fight climate change is planting trees, because trees absorb CO2. So if anything you want to do, plant trees. Don't buy as many things that you don't have to buy, because that takes resources, right? And maybe start talking to your friends. Can we form a small group and make a difference in our little community, in our little neighborhood? And for those of you who are far beyond Sudbury, this can apply to you also. Start small. And often when you're successful at doing something, that often inspires you or other people to do other things. Just like the community groups who've restored fish in Junction Creek, all because of regreening, and reintroductions of the peregrines and all. I mean, there's so many things one can do, but share your idea with friends, with your classroom, see what you could do and take it from there.
This is what I love about this story, is that it's something where really the community does get involved and industry gets involved too. I think so often you can malign mining, you can malign tree cutting. I mean, ultimately, people do need these products. People do use these products. It's not an eel industry in and of itself. And so the Sudbury example is not just a great example of what can be done when people commit to it, but where government, citizens, business all work together to do a common good, where classrooms can take from this presentation and go, wow, if I plant a community garden, if I plant a forest, leave some stuff for pollinators, help, put fish back in a lake, all those things add up in a really positive way to make a big difference. So this is
absolutely, Jesse.
So great. We've got kids in BC too now joining us on YouTube, so that's fantastic. All across the country, coast to coast, which is amazing. Now, one last question to wrap up. In our chat, originally, before this presentation, you mentioned the fact that it's really integral that this work keeps on going. It's not where we can just, we're done now. It's beautiful. There's trees. The lakes are great. It's really integral to continue on with this legacy. Are you seeing that in Sudbury? Are people committed to this? Are they still doing these actions on a day-by-day basis?
The answer is absolutely yes. A day-by-day basis. I mean, we don't plant trees in the wintertime, but we do every summer continue. And I think I mentioned it's about 250,000 trees on average, sometimes more, sometimes up to 1 million, sometimes less, depending where our source of trees come from. So yes, we're continuing to do it. But the beauty, I think, Jesse, for everyone is that the things that have come out of regreening, I mean, people want to come to Sudbury and live here. 40 years ago, this was unimaginable. We were a Moonscape. Comedians across the country made fun of us. We even looked at ourselves and we were ashamed at what was going on here. That has totally changed. We could never have imagined that by regreening the landscape, all of these positive things. We attract businesses now. We're a major tourist attraction. Nobody would have imagined this 40 years ago.
Yeah. And my own personal experience, I mean, when I was a kid, Sudbury was like as far away as you could possibly get. I mean, when you're 10, when you're 15, 4-hour drive, oh my God. And having had the chance to go there a few times, it really is one of the most beautiful places in Canada. The lakes are stunning. The forest everywhere is amazing. You mentioned tourism. I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful town. Science North is in the backdrop of this image behind us, which is one of the elite science centers in all of Canada, if not the elite science center in Canada. So some really, really amazing things. In fact, I'd encourage anyone in Ontario, if you can make it to Sudbury in your life, again, just a classic model of a community that really unites around itself, does some really, really great stuff. And as Franco's been sharing today, it's just a beautiful story of ecological restoration and community success. So Franco, thank you so much for spending some time with me today. I really appreciate it.
Jesse and everyone out there, thank you very much for tuning in, because this is a story that really needs to be told over and over again, and hopefully acts as an example. And if anyone wants to contact me, Jesse has my personal information, so don't hesitate.
Lovely. I certainly will make that happen if classes are keen. And you're welcome back after our month of February. So we've got a month coming up, all celebrating incredible women in STEM. So you're out for that one, unfortunately. But come March, we'll do more of these talks. And I'd love to, encourage more classes to learn about this story. So what we do at the end of every talk, Franco, I'm going to bring in our live teachers. I know they don't have kids with them, but Mr. Armstrong, Miss Delcato, and Miss Nybor, if you want to join me in saying a big thank you to Franco as we